Organisational Behaviour, Buzzy 1029. This is our first substantive session, and we're going to be talking about organisations and goals. Primarily, the main objective for this session is to help us define what we mean when we talk about organisations. So the objectives for the session is that you should be able, after this lecture, to describe the key features of what's called the goal model of organisations. And using this model, you should be able to distinguish what we call formal organisations from other social forms, because the focus of this course is formal organisations. And it's easy for us to think when we talk about organisations that we're just talking about businesses, profit-making businesses. But one of the things I want to get across in this lecture is formal organisations are a broader category than that. And when we think about organisations, we can't just think about businesses. We have to think about other types of organisations as well that might share similar features. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about organisational research methods and just briefly describing what some of the key methods are which are used in research into organisations. So you might remember in the module introduction, we emphasised that organisations are very important and that organisations are all around us, helping us as we go about our daily lives. One of the things, though, when we stop to think about it, is it's difficult to really say what we mean by an organisation. It's difficult to see what a church has in common with an army, has in common with a hospital, has in common with, a consumer goods company or an electrics company or a charity. But we would call them all organisations. If you just go onto social media like I have here, Reddit, and look for the Reddit's organisation, you see all kinds of stuff that isn't really what you would expect we're going to be talking about on this course. I don't really expect I don't imagine that you expected us to be talking about how you could organise baking ingredients. So organisations and organising are quite big terms. For this module, though, we're going to be thinking about a specific definition of organisations. And once we've got this definition, then we can start to talk about how organisations, defined in the way we're going to in a minute, how they behave. And we can talk about how people inside those organisations behave consistently. And generally, this is a really good thing for you to start doing when you're researching or writing about a topic, to be very clear, what's your definition of that thing? What's your definition of the object that you're writing about? So Schein, a man called Edgar Scheiner, an organisational psychologist, offers a quite famous definition of organisations, and this is really where we're going to start this lecture. Schein says that an organisation is the planned coordination of the activities of a number of people for the achievement of some common, explicit purpose or goal. And it's this notion of a goal which is really important. We can almost read Schein's quote backwards. What he says is, when a group of people, so the first thing is an organisation has to have more than one person, and when that group of people get together and agree on something that they want to achieve together, then they start to coordinate and plan their activities, which is what we call an organisation. So one way of thinking about organisations is as controlled environments where the activities of people are predictable because they're all working towards the same goal, the same purpose, the same objective. And so this puts the notion of the goal at the centre of our understanding of organisations. From one of the suggested readings for this week, Herbert Simon, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, writes, "Few discussions of organisation theory manage to get along very far without introducing some concept of an organisational goal. We have to have some understanding of what people in an organisation are working together to achieve to explain why we have organisations." In fact, Schein suggests that this is why we have organisations. There are some things, he tells us, that we can't achieve on our own, and that's when we organise. So this notion of a goal was used to develop what's called the goal model of organisations. This is a term derived by the work of a British sociologist called David Silverman. And the background to this model is it was developed mainly by by sociologists. And those sociologists saw society as being made up of different organisations. And they wanted to understand what was it that made people form particular organisations, because those organisations then formed societies. So what is it that brought people into organisations? Because this is typically different from many other social units which had been discussed by sociologists up to that point, an example of which would be the family. There was a whole load of sociological literatures about families, but we're born into our family. We're not typically born as Apple consumers. We're not typically born as workers at a university. To some extent, we choose membership of those organisations. So sociologists were interested in understanding what brought people into organisations. Why were they there? Again, you can hopefully see how this notion of a goal is a kind of obvious answer to that question. It's also important to note that many of the theorists who developed these ideas were sponsored by businesses. And those businesses wanted to make their organisations work more efficiently. And a lot of the literature deriving a definition of organisations from goals starts primarily with the notion that most organisations want to make a profit, they want to work productively and efficiently. And you'll hopefully see how the goal model really focuses on explaining the efficiencies that are possible when people come together and organise. So just as a quick sort of illustration, this is sort of the background theory that lies behind the goal model. The idea is you have lots of individuals in a society and they get together in various organisations because they want to achieve certain things. You know, maybe they want to get educated in one organisation, they want to be healthy in another organisation, they want to earn a living in another, and then those organisations form societies. Hopefully you'll appreciate I got a bit bored of adding arrows to this diagram, but you could put loads of arrows all over the place. So the goal model is based on this broad understanding of society, but it drills down into the organisation. Here's what it tells us. It says, once a group of people have agreed on their goal, once they've agreed on the things that they want to achieve, they tend to then do certain things, which we call an organisation. They develop a role system, they divide the labour, and they work through patterned interactions. They coordinate their activities, and they start to develop some kind of a hierarchical structure where some people are leaders and others are followers. So let's work through each of these elements of the goal model, and I'm going to do this by using organised crime as an example. This example was picked specifically because it's not a typical business example, but it hopefully will show you how many of the same features which sociologists have seen in businesses can be seen in other types of organisations. So we can start with the goal. What kinds of things do people try to achieve through organisations? Well, Silverman says the first thing we have to acknowledge is when we're talking about an organisational goal, we're not talking about private goals, individuals' goals. So, you might go to work for a company because you want to get paid. That's great, but that's not a collective goal. A collective goal has to be something that exists beyond the individuals. So, in a business, you might come together and say, we need to provide value to our customers in order to have a profitable business, in order to pay us. I like to think of the example of a football team. The team wants to win the match, but individual players might all want to score goals. But obviously they can't all score a goal in order to win the match because some of them have to defend. They can't all just be working towards their individual goals. They also have this collective team goal to win. It's the team that wins, not just the individuals. So where can we find organisational goals? How can we identify them? And how do people in organisations identify them? There's a number of approaches offered in the literature. One is that organisations tend to write down their goal formally. And we see this in things like mission statements for organisations. A writer called Etzioni argued that organisations' goals are defined by their leaders. So a leader of an organisation, say a university, might say, our goal is to educate people, as many people as possible. Or they might say, no, our goal is to start selling lots of coffee on campus. Or they might say, our goal is to make lots of money. You can see how it's the same organisation, but the leaders would be able to change the goal of the organisation. One of the things which organisational researchers found, though, is that these two approaches, looking at what's written down or what leaders say, ignores the conflict and diversity of goals which exist in most organisations. So others said, rather than looking at what organisations say, we can look at what they do. Blau and Scott in the 1960s suggested that we can look to see who benefits from the organisation. And they said there's 4 types of beneficiaries of organisations. It could either be the members of the organisation who benefit primarily. So that might be, the workers of a business organisation. It might be the owners, so say the managers or the shareholders, who are the primary beneficiaries. It might be the users, which would be the customers. Or it could be the general public. So here we can define an organisation's goal in terms of who is the primary beneficiary and what do they benefit from it. Do they get a job? Do they earn a reward on their a return on their capital? Do they get a great product? Do they get some kind of public service? Simon, in the suggested reading for this week, has a much more difficult and complex account. He suggests that actually the only way to define an organisation's goals is to see what is it that constrains the activity of everybody in the organisation. He has quite a complicated understanding of that, which if you're interested in, you can read a bit more into. But it's actually beyond probably the scope of this course. But he says if you look at different people in an organisation, they'll probably all tell you different things. But he said the sensible, intelligent analyst can see that there's going to be something that's constraining and shaping all of their choices. And this, he says, is the goal. So let's think about it. What's the goal of organised crime? Well, we'll focus on the American Mafia just because there's loads of cool films about them and loads of really good documentaries. We might say that the Mafia's goal is to commit crime or to make money. Actually, it's sort of both of those things and neither of them. The Mafia's goal is to create an environment amongst people outside of the law in which there are certain rules they all have to follow. The Mafia's goal is to create an organisation which has more power than any one individual. Is to create some kind of structure and order amongst criminals, some honour amongst thieves. And this has the knock-on benefit of making it more profitable and making it less likely that people will get caught. This is the American Mafia's, or my interpretation of the American Mafia's goal. And if you watch, there was a recent Netflix documentary called Fear City where they talk about this and they explain why do people join the Mafia? What is it they get out of it? And this seems to be what it is. They get some protection. They get people who are going to watch their back. They make the ability to make not necessarily more money, but not get caught because they now have the American Mafia's protection, not only from other criminals, but also from the police. But whatever it might be, once a group of people have organised around their goal, they tend to then do a few of the same things. One of the first things they tend to do is enter into what's called a division of labour. So whatever it is that an organisation is trying to achieve, typically it would be possible for every member of the organisation to do everything. But this is usually not a very efficient way of organising. And actually, if you go back to that definition by Shine, the idea that people organise when there's something they want to do that they couldn't do on their own, what this starts to tell us is when people get into organisations, they're going to agree to do some work other people agree to do some other work so that they can collectively achieve something that they would be unable to do on their own. And this typically makes organisations more productive, more efficient, and more effective than groups of individuals working in isolation. And we see this in the mafia. Once people enter into the mafia, they start to do particular jobs. They might be low-level criminals or wise guys. They might be captains that run crews. They might be heads of families that tell people what to do. But in entering into this organisation, they start to get these extra goals like protection from prosecution, protection from the police, protection from other criminals they couldn't necessarily get on their own. One of the other things that organisation theorists have found about division of labour is that it allows what's called role distancing. What this means is individuals in organisations can engage in some quite unethical activities. They can engage in acts which individually they'd be unwilling to do because they're not doing all of the activity. And this was illustrated very powerfully by a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman in his analysis of the Nazi Holocaust in the Second World War. Bauman argued that the way the Holocaust was organised meant that the perpetrators of the mass murders were only ever doing small pieces of the process of killing, such that it was possible for them to feel like they weren't actually killing anybody. You know, one prison guard would round up a group of prisoners, another would take them to a location, another would then move them off of a transporter into a room, another would then go into that room and press a button or turn a lever that would do something which had been designed by other people. It turned out they would often poison people. Another group of people would then go into the room and remove the bodies. Other groups of people would then take those bodies and burn them or bury them or take their belongings, like this pile of glasses illustrates. So by dividing up the labour, not only do you mean that an organisation can be more productive and can achieve things that individuals couldn't, but it can also do things that individuals would be unwilling to do on their own. And again, we see examples of this in the American Mafia. In the American Mafia, you have bosses who can order killings, but they don't have to do the killings themselves. And we've heard descriptions of some of the bosses as being white-collar dons, that people picture them as not actually being sort of thugs and criminals, but more like corporate managers. And they can feel like that themselves because they're not actually having to do any unethical criminal activities themselves, but the organisation does it for them. This is what role distancing is. And that leads us nicely to the next element of organisations, based on the goal model, which is they tend to develop a role system. What this means is, across organisations and within organisations, people don't just have particular activities to do. They normally have particular ways of doing them, what we might call a role. So in an organisation, there's often, like in Friends, there's the funny one, there's the clever one, there's the clean one, there's the kooky one, there's the fashionable one. In organisations, you get similar roles, often linked to particular activities. So you might have a doctor, a lecturer, an accountant, a manager, a marketer. These are roles which people play. So it's not you in the organisation, it's you performing the role of being a manager. And that comes with a set of expectations about how you'll behave, what you'll do. This has several benefits. It means organisations can grow, but individuals can move between organisations of the same type. So if you happen to be a successful manager, you can move from one organisation to another. If you pass your accountancy qualifications, you could be an accountant at a university or an accountant for an organised crime family. You're just an accountant. And when you're being an accountant, you are performing a role. So organisations occur when people agree on a goal, then agree to divide their labour to achieve that goal, develop some kinds of roles that don't just tell people what to do, but also how to do it. So this is a visual representation of the American Mafia's role system, where you have bosses, captains, and foot soldiers or wise guys. And each of these types of roles, each of these types of people are expected not just to do certain things, but to do them in a certain way. They can talk to certain people about certain things using certain languages. That leads us to the next element of organisations, which is the notion of patterned interactions. When people organise, they not only perform particular activities, but they tend to fall into patterned or routine ways of interacting with each other. They develop their own technical languages or jargons, they use buzzwords, they use particular, words and actions that people perhaps wouldn't use outside of the organisation. Hopefully you can start to see how all of these elements are interrelated with each other. Roles have particular ways of speaking, particular expertise, that then develop ways of interacting with other roles to get the labour done. And organisation theorists have found that actually looking at organisations in practice, you can really make sense of them by thinking in terms of scripts, that people are reading out scripts that are very specific to their organisations. In the American Mafia, we see things like rituals taking place. When you join the Mafia, there's particular rituals you have to go through. You have to have qualified in certain ways. This is what we mean when we say patterned interactions. Patterned or routine ways that members of an organisation interact with each other. The final element of organisations that the goal model talks to us about is that organisations, in order to have a role system, in order to have some division of labour, in order to have some patterned interactions, typically have to have some kind of coordination function or hierarchy. They have to have some people whose job isn't to do the work, but to coordinate and tell others how to do the work. And this means they have to have some people that have more power, because they have the power to tell others what to do, than others. This is usually an explanation for why we have management in organisations. The job of the manager isn't to do the work, but to tell others, to organise others in a way that lets them do the work. And again, we see examples of this in the Mafia. You have the Mafia Don, or if you watch the Netflix documentary The Commission, a group of Mafia Dons who between them would organise what should the Mafia do, what should particular groups or crews be allowed to do, what crimes should people be allowed to commit. They have power over the organisation. So, if we go back to our original picture, we can see how once a group of people have agreed on a goal, it kind of makes intuitive sense. They start to divide the labour up. When they divide the labour, they develop a role system. And that role system and that division of labour pattern people's interactions. But to work, it requires some coordination, which means you have to have some people in charge. You have to have some people who can tell others what to do. You have to have a hierarchy. This is what we mean by the goal model. The goal model is essentially this picture. And it helps us to start to differentiate organisations of different types. Firstly, we have what's called formal organisations, who typically have an explicit goal. They'll have defined roles and a division of labour. They'll often have some formal membership processes, some very structured interactions, and an agreed hierarchy. So examples can be multinational companies, charities, administrations, organised crime, political bodies, religious institutions. We call these formal organisations. We primarily call them formal organisations because they've formally agreed on their roles. They've often written them down. We can divide or subtract formal organisations from what are called informal organisations. Informal organisations refer to the fact that within formal organisations, people typically develop their own relationships that go outside of the formal structure. So informal organisations tend to sit inside of formal organisations. It might be a group of people that went to the same school, that form a group within an organisation to support each other. It might be, underrepresented communities, BAME, or particular genders that feel underrepresented in an organisation and form an informal group that supports each other. It might be any number of different reasons why. There might be any number of different reasons why a group could form. It might just be a group of managers or a particular department gets together and they form an informal organisation who might have an explicit goal, like promoting, underprivileged communities, or an implicit goal, like a group of managers getting together and saying, let's take over this organisation. So there's often in informal organisations some coordination of labour and roles, but they typically aren't formally agreed. They don't sit down and draw out an organisational chart. They just sort of develop over time. There's often diffuse membership rituals. You can either just join because you are a particular type of person, or perhaps you come have a particular background. And the informal organisations, unlike formal organisations, are often wrought with personal politics and power. So yeah, an example might be a clique of top managers. We see examples of this in representations of the American mafia. In The Sopranos, for example, a high-up captain called Phil Leotardo, this guy here, falls out with a number of other members of the mafia and starts a war between different groups because his brother gets killed in a way that wasn't supposed to happen. And so here we see how his blood ties, his relationships to his families, form this informal organisation within a formal organisation. And if you're interested in that, I suggest watching the last series of The Sopranos. Finally, we can then distinguish not just formal and informal organisations, but also what are called social organisations. So a social organisation occurs when just a group of people get together. They don't really necessarily have a goal. They might literally have no goal. They might just be there, just randomly put together. But they still find some way of dividing up labour. They still find some way of developing roles, often conventionally or socially. They don't necessarily have specific membership rituals, but they do have personal power and politics. So an example might be, a group of friends. When you join a flat in a hall of residence, and people develop particular roles in the group. You might have the nerdy one, the cool one, and so on and so forth. You might have particular ways of speaking to each other, particular ways of interacting. And you might have some kinds of goals, like we want to have a good time, or we all want to do really well on our course, but it's not written down at all. So this is a social organisation. Our interest in this course is formal organisations. We're interested in understanding formal organisations, all spelt differently to the rest of the slides, so I'll just quickly change them. But what we need to keep in mind is an understanding that what happens inside formal organisations, particularly individuals' behaviour in formal organisations, might be affected by their membership of informal and social organisations. But when we talk about organisations behaving, we're most interested in formal organisations. That is, organisations with an explicit goal, an explicit role system, division of labour, patterned interactions, coordination, hierarchy and leadership. So just a few more points before we conclude, and I apologise that this is perhaps a little bit of a lengthy lecture. A really interesting example of an organisation formally organising around informal organisations is a religious organisation known as AA. AA, well, there's various elements of it which are really interesting, but the thing which I find most interesting, and if you want to look into this some more, you could read the Wikipedia page on it, is that members of the organisation only know two other people in the organisation. They know somebody who's above them that can tell them what to do, and somebody that's below them in the organisational hierarchy that they can tell what to do. So they have no idea who else is in the organisation. They have no way of forming an informal organisation. And what you see in many formal organisations is this practice but in a different way. You see organisations trying to write out informal organisations. So we have HR policies that mean you can't just give a job to your friend. We have policies that mean you have to be fair and equitable to all members of an organisation. You can't rely on informal organisations. So there you have it. That's what we mean by the goal model of organisations. And hopefully you can start to distinguish between different types of organisations and different social units such as the family. Now I just want to move on to talk a little bit about the types of research and the background to our understanding of organisations. When I talked about the background of the goal model, I talked about how many sociologists started working with businesses, and this was known as scientific management, and it led to a structural analysis of organisations, the development of the goal model, which in turn led to an understanding of informal organising, which led to many sociologists moving more into social psychology and formal cognitive psychology to understand individuals' behaviour. And so now we have this thing called organisation studies, which is a mixture of more business-focused, what's called structural analysis or functional analysis, psychology and sociology. And it means for you guys, you're going to have a real interdisciplinary course in understanding organisations. But it's useful to know a little bit about where the data for organisations, for understanding of organisations comes from, and it's also helpful if I spell words correctly on my slides. So I'll just quickly talk through. Generally speaking, there's three types of research that people do about organisations. There's theoretical work, which often takes theories from sociology or psychology and applies them to organisations. In some cases, there is theories that are built or constructed specifically to organisations. So the goal model that we've looked at today, that is a theory that has been built within organisational research. And often underpinning whether both theory borrowing and theory building has been what's called conceptualisation, trying to define what we mean by organisations, what we mean by all of the elements of organisations. So this is theoretical work. It usually is quite dry, often complicated, often difficult to read, and often requires a great deal of prior knowledge of the disciplines which theories are being borrowed from. There's also empirical accounts of organisations, and by empirical we mean examples of, or accounts, where researchers have actually gone into organisations to look at what happens. This is sometimes used to test theories. So, you might take a theory from psychology and then go and look to see, does it actually work in organisations? Do people behave like the theory says that they would? This is called hypothesis testing or experimental methods. It also can involve going into organisations, not with a theory, but just trying to describe what happens in those organisations to then build a theory out of. This is typically called ethnography. And it involves an organisational researcher going into an organisation, observing what happens, writing about it, and developing concepts to help describe what happened, and then conceptualizations of relationships between concepts or explanations for why things happen in the way they do. So these are called empirical accounts. Typical here are general social science methods that you're hopefully going to become more familiar with across your course, like interviews, experiments, surveys, questionnaires. And a final theme of organisational research, which is perhaps slightly different from some of the other topics that you're going to be looking at on your courses, is historical studies. These are quite similar to ethnographies, but they are not observations of things that are happening, in the case of ethnographies, but descriptions of things that have happened. And this can be really powerful because it allows scholars not to influence the account, which is what can happen when an ethnographer goes into an organisation. They can look for what they can find what they're looking for. But when we're looking at something that has already happened, of course we know many of the facts. We know what happened to the organisation when it did these things. And so we can prove our explanations and our conceptualizations. So, there you go. Hopefully, you feel now like you've got a decent enough understanding of the goal model, that you could describe the features of the goal model, that you could use that goal model to distinguish formal organisations from other social forms such as informal organisations and social organisations. And you've heard some of the key terms in organisational research. And next time I record one of these, I promise it will be a little bit shorter, and I'll bring a drink so that I don't have to keep coughing. If you've got any questions, please bring them to the Ask Me Anything session or post them on the Moodle discussion site. I look forward to seeing you all in the lecture engagement sessions.